Good morning. Welcome to the First Unitarian Church of Cincinnati. My name is Dan Schneider, and I will serve as your worship leader today. I'm grateful to share this service with you this morning, both in person and online. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Good. Try to keep close to the microphone. Our church is a place you can bring your whole self, your full identity, your questioning mind, and your expansive heart. We are a community committed to social justice and to supporting the various spiritual and ethical paths of our members and friends. Our congregation was founded in 1830, and we have worshiped in this building since 1889. But we acknowledge that we occupy stolen land that is the ancestral home of the ancient earthwork and mound builders, and most recently, the Miamia and Shawnee peoples. This is an uncomfortable history and a tension that we must constantly recognize as we struggle with the implications of that profound injustice. If you would like to know more about our church or about the Unitarian Universalist faith, please contact us by mailing member-care@firstuu.com. For those watching at home, this email address is in the description of today's service or on your YouTube page. Our congregation strives to be welcoming to all, so you will see signs for various accommodations posted around the church and listed in the order of service. Our ushers would be glad to answer any questions. Today's flowers are from Mary Mark. There they are. In honor of our beloved community here at First Unitarian Church. Before we begin our service today, please briefly rise and greet your neighbor and say hi in the chat until I ring the singing bowl to bring us together. But first, let's wave to the people watching from home. All right. As Chloe lights our chalice, I will share these words from Christine Robinson. We gather this hour as a people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We lift this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, in celebration of the life we share together. Now, please rise as you are willing and able and sing hymn 113, 113. In this hymnal, Where is Our Holy Church? Now please direct your attention to the screen behind the pulpit for this morning's message for all ages.
Morning, everyone. I'm joining you today from my home office to share with you the story of Jennifer Keelan. Now, just for a moment, I want to take you back to 33 years in the past, spring of 1990. Jennifer Keelan is headed to Washington, D.C. to attend a protest, along with a number of other activists. Now, Jennifer is no stranger to protests. For 2 years before the pandemic, she averaged one protest every 6 months, and she's even been arrested. But if you had seen Jennifer then, in 1990, it would have been easy to dismiss her. For one, Jennifer is female. 2, in the spring of 1990, Jennifer was only 8 years old. And 3, Jennifer uses a wheelchair. However, this is the exact reason she was in Washington, D.C. all those years ago. You see, the world before 1990 made very few accommodations for people with disabilities. Buildings didn't have ramps. Sidewalks didn't have curb cuts. And people with disabilities could be refused service just because they were disabled. Jennifer herself couldn't go to school with her own sister. So, on March 12, 1990, Jennifer and 475 other disabled activists went to D.C. to crawl up the 76 marble steps to the Capitol's West Front. They were begging the government to pass the Americans with Disabilities Act, which had been stalled in Congress because big business thought it would cost them too much. The climb took Jennifer almost an hour to complete, but she is quoted as saying, "I'll take all night if I have to." The next day, this picture of Jennifer on her hands and knees appeared in the news. And the protest worked! On July 26, 1990, then President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law. He is quoted as saying, "Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down." I share this story with you because I want you to know how powerful you are. No matter your age, your ability, your gender, you have the power. Your activism matters. I just have to wonder, what matters to you?
Well, I know Meredith did that remotely today, recorded. If she were here, I would tell her, "Great job, Meredith." And so, Meredith, if you're watching, great job. Thank you for that. Our young people may now be dismissed to Sunday school class. Jan Connolly. Oh, there you are.
And I appear. Did you notice a change? Well, today is the day of dedication for our new chalice. This day of dedication has been a long time coming. For those of you who are new to this congregation, the process started in late 2021 when I mentioned that for 15 years that I was a member of this congregation, I had been longing to see a significant and instantly recognizable symbol of our faith on display in this sanctuary. I was encouraged to do some research and present my findings to the board and to the congregation for a vote. Tracking down the history of the flaming chalice was much easier than actually finding the physical symbol or an artisan to make one. Flaming chalices of this type were nearly impossible to find. A local artist was commissioned to produce a custom one for our church, but when that didn't work out, we were able to purchase this fine chalice in the summer of 2023. More about this chalice later. But first, I would like to share with you some information about the history of the symbol and a very dramatic and fascinating symbol and story it is. At first glance, this very first symbol of, or logo of our faith, the chalice with the flame, seems rather simple and sort of innocuous. But the purpose was anything but innocuous. I was surprised to discover how vitally important it was, for it was created and used in the service of Nazi resistance during World War II. Here's how that symbol, or logo, if you will, came to be. In the 1930s, there was an Austrian artist named Hans Deutsch. He was living in Paris. He had drawn cartoons critical of Hitler. So when the Nazis invaded Paris in 1940, he knew he needed to get as far away as possible. He abandoned all he had, and he traveled from country to country until he eventually ended up in Portugal. It was there in 1941 in Lisbon that Deutsch met the Reverend Charles Joy, Executive Director of the Unitarian Service Committee, or USC. From his Lisbon headquarters, Reverend Joy oversaw a secret network of couriers and agents who assisted Eastern Europeans, Jews and Unitarians among them, who needed to escape Nazi persecution. Reverend Joy felt this new, unknown Unitarian service organization, founded in Boston, needed some visual image to represent Unitarianism, especially to government agencies abroad. So, Reverend Joy asked Deutsch to create a symbol for their papers, to, quote, make them look official, to give dignity and importance to them, and at the same time to symbolize the spirit of our work. When a document may keep a man out of jail, give him standing with governments and police, it's important that it look important. Deutsch was impressed with the work of the service committee and soon was working for it. He later wrote this very moving message to Reverend Joy about the humanitarian work he witnessed him doing. Quote, there is something that urges me to tell you how much I admire your utter self-denial and readiness to serve, to sacrifice everything your time, your health, your well-being to help, help, help. He goes on, I am not what you may actually call a believer, but if your kind of life is a profession of your faith, as it is, I'm sure, then religion, ceasing to be magic and mysticism, becomes confession to practical philosophy and, what is more, to active, really useful work. And this religion, with or without a heading, is one to which even a godless fellow like myself can say wholeheartedly, yes. So with pen and ink, he drew a chalice with a flame. The design was made into a seal for papers and a badge for agents moving refugees to freedom. Thus, Hans Deutsch made his lasting contribution to the UUSC and, in time, to the Unitarian Universalism all around the world. It was, Joy wrote his board in Boston, quote, the kind of chalice which the Greeks and Romans put on their altars. The holy burning oil in it is a symbol of helpfulness and sacrifice. When Deutsch designed the flaming chalice, he had never seen a Unitarian church or even heard a sermon. What he had seen was faith in action. People who were willing to risk everything for others in a time of urgent need. Here you see two examples of such service for that new organization during and soon after World War II. Notice the name in the picture with many children and the symbol on the package in the other picture. When were two overlapping circles added to the symbol? I was surprised. Not until 1961, when Unitarianism and Universalism merged, one circle for each tradition. And when did the logo become an actual three-dimensional object? This is what really surprised me. In the early 1980s. Interestingly, all evidence suggests it came through the children's religious education programs. UUA history explains that the curricula used in that late 1970s period stressed the meaning of the chalice and encouraged children to make chalices in different media. Eventually, those chalices morphed into objects that could be lit. The first documented uses of these chalices in the sanctuary are from Sundays on which the children and youth led worships and demonstrated their practice to the adult congregation. As for our two-ringed flame chalice, this one here, we have this gentleman to thank. Has an interesting name, Mordecai Roth. And here he is lighting his Tree of Life chalice at the UUA General Assembly in 2012. Ours is a plainer version of that chalice. A little bit about Mr. Roth. After retiring from his dental practice, Mordecai took a sculpture class at a state college. After all, isn't dentistry a form of sculpture? For many of us. Not long after that, a congregant at his church in Surprise, Arizona, asked him to make a bronze chalice in memory of her daughter who had recently died. His then minister was so taken with that he brought it to General Assembly one year to show it off. I believe it's been used there ever since. Soon after, the orders started coming in. But by the time of the 2012 UUA article that I read, 132 of Mr. Roth's chalices of various sizes had been purchased by individuals, but mostly by congregations. From the time of Mr. Roth's death in 2013 until this year, his son-in-law continued to take orders for castings of the chalice. He told me in our phone conversation that due to casting costs, they will no longer be made. And in fact, we have purchased the very last one. In conclusion, I'd like to add that although the flaming chalice is the official symbol of the Unitarian Universalist Association and Unitarian Universalism Service Committee, there is no one official meaning for it. Like our faith and our faith tradition, its meaning is open to interpretation. Perhaps for you, the flame is an expression of one of our congregational hymns, the fire of commitment. And for others, an expression of what Ralph Waldo Emerson called the divine spark, the manifestation of divine possibility within each human soul. Whatever the interpretation, having heard this history, this symbol will remind us of the evolution of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. And lighting this chalice today and every Sunday will help us feel a much larger connection with the thousands of UU and other liberal congregations who are doing the same, perhaps at this very moment, lighting their own chalice, the symbol of our faith.
Thank you, Jan, for your leadership in making this happen. Our November Share of the Plate offering is for the Shiloh Food Bank. For several years now, our congregation has been partnering with the Shiloh Food Bank to assist families in need of additional food. I'll talk more about that later. Excuse me. Your contributions go directly to supporting people with great need. If you are inspired to donate to Shiloh or to support the work of First Church, there are several methods of giving. These are listed in the order of service, and there are links in the description of today's service on our YouTube channel for folks watching online. Just click on More at the end of the sermon description. If you are visiting us for the first time, please let the plate pass you by. We're just glad you're here.
For everyone born Reverend Charles Joy, right before he founded the American Service Committee, stood at this pulpit and was our minister for over a year, and he was the Reverend Alex Riegel before Alex Riegel. He was the developmental minister, and one of his radical ideas was we should do away with pew rentals and go to an annual canvass. So,
one more thing. Jane Connolly has really worked at this, and we owe her.
Jan, would you stand up for a moment? From time to time, I get asked about this work, as if in our minds these two things can't go together. But in my heart, it's very obvious to me that these two things must go together. So in my own spiritual study and practice and the work I seek to do in the world, I see these things as integrally related, not separate in the least bit. And I once wrote a blog post that expresses my view on this, and I'm actually going to read a blog post for you this morning, followed by a poem by the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. And as I read this, you might think about a number of things taking place in our world today. You might think about the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, or the Ukrainians and the Russians. Or you might think about people in your own life, people you know who may be struggling, people you know who may be in need. And recognize that as you think about these folks, there truly is no separation between you or us and them. And in fact, the phrase, no separation between you, us, and them, is a false phrase. Because if there's no separation, there is no you, us, and them. So my blog post has remained dormant since the beginning of COVID, and I hope to rejuvenate those efforts. And this particular one begins by a reference to a previous one. So if you're curious about the previous one, alexanderriegel.com has about 20 blog posts on it, and you can find a misty morning musing in that one. In my previous post, A Misty Morning Musing, I raised the topic of the difference between occupying a dualistic perspective on the world versus occupying a non-dual perspective, known in Eastern mystical traditions, originally in the philosophy of Vedanta, as Advaita. Now, Vaita means two or three or more in the Sanskrit. Advaita is the negation of this, and it means not two or three or more. In sum, Advaita, or the non-dual perspective, is the perspective in which one experiences oneself as an aspect within the unity of being. Being, as it were, unified in a seamless whole, as in that Eden-like state wherein Adam and Eve walked in union with God. Now, this can quickly become an overwhelming philosophical concept for the uninitiated, which is most of us. At the same time, it's a very important concept to understand from at least two perspectives: the mystical and the ethical. So stay with me as I lead you into the ethical import of this philosophy of Advaita. I think you will find Advaita key to understanding not only mysticism in general, but the ethical implications of mysticism as well. To wit, Jesus. Yes, Jesus was, in my reading of him, an Advaitist, as his ethics clearly indicate. He operated from a state of consciousness that recognized the unity of all being. There are indeed significant ethical implications that arise from mystical states. Let me repeat that. There are indeed significant ethical implications that arise from mystical states, a subject not given nearly enough due. Most people merely seeking the mystical high without regard for the demands that follow from such experience. One of the best and simplest descriptions of Advaita that I have encountered is in J.D. Salinger's short story, Teddy. Teddy is a 10-year-old boy who is the reincarnation of an advanced soul. As such, Teddy fascinates as a type of mystic savant, to steal an apt phrase from Kenneth Slowensky. Teddy possesses exceptional intelligence and an apparent ability to know what ought not to be knowable. For instance, there are several places in the story where Teddy correctly anticipates the day and manner of his death. But regarding Teddy and Advaita, there is a point in the story where Teddy relates his first mystical experience. He says, "When I was 6, I saw that everything was God, and my hair stood on end," said Teddy. "It was on a Sunday. My sister was only a tiny child then. She was drinking her milk, and all of a sudden, I saw that she was God, and the milk was God. I mean, all she was doing was pouring God into God, if you know what I mean. In sum, it's all God, the fundamental teaching of Vedanta. So Advaita can be understood on two levels. First, it can be understood as an abstract idea, and this is to understand Advaita as a philosophical principle. Second, it can be understood as a subjective reality. This is to understand Advaita as a mystical perception. And this latter understanding of Advaita is what interests us, especially in regard to its ethical implications. For this we invoke Jesus. In the Gospel of Matthew, we find a story of Jesus meting out judgment. To some, he says, "Come, you who are blessed. Take your place in the kingdom. For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was in prison, and you visited me." These blessed ones question Jesus, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry, or as a stranger, or sick, or in prison, and helped you?" And Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these, you did unto me." To others, Jesus says, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, for I was hungry and you did not feed me. I was a stranger and you did not welcome me. I was sick and you did not care for me. I was in prison and you did not visit me." And these cursed ones question Jesus, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry, or as a stranger, or sick, or in prison, and did not help you?" Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for the least of these, you did not do unto me." Now, if we approach this scripture from the dualistic perspective, it will read as an ethical charge to care for the least of these, meaning all people in need. And this is no mean ethical charge, and indeed it is quite profound. At the same time, from the dualistic perspective, other people, including the least of these, remain as objects to us, ultimately separate from us. Hence the protest, Lord, when did we see you hungry, or as a stranger, or sick, or in prison? Read from an Advaitist perspective, from the perspective of the unity of being, this scripture has an even more profound meaning and makes even more sense in the context of Jesus' life and ministry. No one, including the least of these, is separate from anyone. People are not objects to which one applies ethical principles. Rather, all of us are aspects within the unity of being, being, as it were, unified in a seamless whole, as in that Eden-like state wherein Adam and Eve walked in union with God. That's the mystical perception. Hence, Jesus was the hungry. Jesus was the stranger. Jesus was the sick. Jesus was the prisoner, not in an abstract philosophical thought experiment way, but in actuality. Indeed, we too are the hungry. We too are the stranger, the sick, the prisoner. There is simply no separation of beings. It is this Advaitist perspective that the mystical Jesus held, and it is from this perspective that his ethics originate. And this is the part to let sink in. It is from this perspective that Jesus' ethics originate. It's only when we understand this that we truly understand Jesus' words. Whatever you did for the least of these, you did unto me. This is not a thought experiment he places before us. This is not a metaphor. This is an ontological reality that Jesus perceived and from which he lived and taught. In sum, when we consider Jesus' life and ministry from the perspective of Advaita, we discover a much richer, more compelling, and truer sense of who Jesus was. A Jewish mystic. And how he exhorted us to live our lives. From a mystical perspective, we are to realize that we already exist in a sacred reality. The kingdom of heaven is spread out about you. From an ethical perspective, we are to act in the world as though our every action ripples through the entirety of creation, from the smallest single-celled organism to the divine itself. If this is a little too philosophical and abstract, consider these words from the Beatles. I am he, as you are he, as you are me, and we are all together. Goo goo gajoob. Or invoking Vedanta again, Tat Vam Asi. Thou art that. And if it's still too philosophical for you, consider this poem by the recently passed Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. In Buddhist parlance, this whole concept of Advaita, or the unity of being, has the implication, just like in Christianity in the contemplative traditions and in the Vedas or the Hindu tradition, that there is no separation. And hopefully this will come true, will be perceived to be true, after I read this poem about the Buddhist concept of interbeing. Thich Nhat Hanh writes, "Don't say that I'll depart tomorrow, because even today I still arrive. Look deeply. I arrive in every second to be a bud on a spring branch, to be a tiny bird with wings still fragile, learning to sing in my new nest, to be a caterpillar in the heart of a flower, to be a jewel hiding itself inside a stone. I still arrive in order to laugh and to cry, in order to fear and to hope. The rhythm of my heart is the birth and death of all that are alive. I am the mayfly metamorphosizing on the surface of the water, and I am the bird which, when spring comes, arrives in time to eat the mayfly. I am the frog swimming happily in the clear pond, and I am also the grass snake who, approaching in silence, feeds itself on the frog. And I am the child in Uganda, all skin and bones, my legs as thin as bamboo sticks. And I am the arms merchant selling deadly weapons to Uganda. I am the 12-year-old girl, refugee on a small boat, who throws herself into the ocean after being raped by a sea pirate. And I am the pirate, my heart not yet capable of seeing and loving. I am a member of the Politburo with plenty of power in my hands, and I am the man who has to pay his debt of blood to my people, dying slowly in a forced labor camp. My joy is like spring, so warm it makes flowers bloom in all walks of life. My pain is like a river of tears, so full it fills the four oceans. So please call me by my true names, so I can hear all my cries and laughs at once, so I can see that my joy and pain are one. Please call me by my true names, so I can wake up, so the door of my heart can be left open, the door of compassion.
I would like to begin this morning with a reading from the UU World, which is sent to all members of our church and other UU churches. This is a quotation from Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt, President of the Unitarian Universalist Association. Dr. Betancourt was asked a question: how do you inspire older members of the UU community who see social justice gains they've worked so hard to help achieve being rolled back? Hope is a spiritual discipline, not a mood. It's about what we are investing into the possibilities of the world. Every generation is challenged to leave the world better than they found it. I'll give you a preview of what I'm going to say briefly this morning. I'm going to begin talking about that one word, hope, and I will end with hope. Between those, I will talk about how we get there to support the things that Alec was talking about. Let me read that one more time. Hope is a spiritual discipline, not a mood. It's about what we are investing into the possibilities of the world. Every generation is challenged to leave the world better than they found it. I'm here today to talk to you about an organization that I knew little about a year ago, and that, in fact, I think is still a well-kept secret in much of this part of the country. I was vaguely aware of it until earlier this year. Someone I admire and respect was on the nominating committee and asked me to be on the board of trustees of this organization, and now I am. It's called Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice. And I decided I wanted to learn more about it, so I did. As an educator, I think the best way often to learn is by doing. And this organization had a conference in Washington, D.C., late January, and I went to Washington. It was called Farming for the Future. And I will tell you where I'm going with this. You have the website for the UU for Social Justice in your order of service. I'm hoping that some of you, when this is over, will look at that website, because that's where you'll find much more information than I can give you today. I just want to inspire you, I hope, to look at that. But at it's not necessary, I should add, it's not necessary for you to go to Washington. You may do that on occasion. They do occasionally have events in Washington. If you can afford to get there, have a place to stay, that's great. But you can also find other ways of speaking forth for justice. If you go to that website, you can look up on the left side and it says membership at the top. I hope you would consider becoming a member of this organization. If you look on the right side of the top, it says action alerts. It has many action alerts on many issues. And you can just send messages to your Congress people, senators, members of the House, wherever you live in the United States. And you can also sign up to be on an action team. And I'll talk about that later. So I went to Washington for this conference, and what I found was that it was in cooperation with other UU organizations, but the UUs for social justice were seen as the experts on how to lobby, how to speak to people in Congress. If you look at this insert, you can see I followed up with thank you notes to the people I talked to. They were not the senators themselves. This was an aide to Senator Vance. And this is very sincere, and it said what we wanted to say. And it shows, again, the theme of how I have found through many years of experience of doing this, not just with this organization, but with others, what's the best way to approach members of Congress? Stories and solutions. Facts and feelings. You can't just come at them with facts and say, do this, do that. If you can tell personal stories, they listen and pay attention. So that's why I told about my experience growing up on a very small farm in Ohio. And one year that I remembered when everything rained all year, and our crops failed, and we were worried about how we were going to keep the farm. That's what has an impact on people, and it can be related to climate change, because many people are being affected by that more often now. So that's what I said here. And the other thing is that no other UU organization does this in the nation's capital in the way that UUSJ does. The other thing is that it is, I said, a bipartisan approach. I mentioned in my note to Senator Vance's aide, I appreciate his support for a bipartisan approach to this. I have had previous experience at lobbying in Washington with programs I used to work with that were federally funded, and I found that this is what works. Getting all dressed up and going to Washington with big expense, a lot of time and trouble, it works. Second to that, sending emails, letters to your people in Congress, it works. They do pay attention to them, and as I said, you can go to the UUSJ website and easily do it. If anybody has any questions later, I'll be around if you want more detailed information. Okay, and what I think is important to say also, and this was true of the other organization I did lobbying with. The most important thing is to have a consistent message and a consistent presence in Washington. It's not very advisable to wait until you have a Congress that you think is more in line with your values. What is more sensible is to always be there with a consistent message and to reach out to everyone in Congress. That's how things get done. That's how we got support for the federally funding for the programs I work with, and that's how we can achieve the things that we want as UUs. There are 4 issue areas, I should tell you, for the UUSJ. And I go by IDE, immigration, democracy, environment, and economics. And you'll see that action areas. It says join an action team. You can join one of those teams if you want. And I think it is certainly true that many of the social justice issues that we deal with are national issues and can be best addressed nationally. And they have campaigns called Right Here, Right Now. That's both spelled W-R-I-T-E. And that's where you go to your website and you can write to folks. So, there's one thing I want to close with, and that is something that you can also find on the UUSJ website. I was asked to write a commentary, which I did. And I chose one of the four major areas that I was most interested in. That was immigration justice. Although I went to the Farm Bill conference, this is about immigration. Oh, one thing I want to add before I forget it, I'm sorry. Before I go. Even if you don't care about farming, we all eat. And many of us volunteer at a food pantry with people who can't get enough to eat. That's where the money for that comes from the Farm Bill. Money that goes to SNAP, what used to be called food stamps, comes from the Farm Bill. So you could go online, get the information about Farm Bill, and say anything you want about your personal stories, about knowing people who are insecure, have food insecurity, and then talk about the needs. It's all there. Okay. This is called Living in Hope for Immigration Justice. When many of my ancestors came to Ohio from Germany in the 19th century, there were no federal restrictions on immigration. Compared to today, entering the United States was relatively easy. While many of us like to say we're a nation of immigrants and their descendants, that statement makes invisible the millions of people indigenous to this land and those brought here as slaves. Some of my ancestors settled on land that had been recently taken from the indigenous people of the area. My dad's side of the family encountered people who were neither immigrants nor children of immigrants. In 1882, my great-grandparents purchased a farm where members of my family lived for 85 years, and where I grew up. Near the farm was a community of formerly enslaved people and their families. My grandfather, who was born on the farm in 1884, grew up hearing stories of the horrors of slavery and bequeathed to his family a belief in racial equality. Today, the image that comes to mind for most Americans concerning what is called the immigration problem is that of brown people from Mexico, other Latin American nations, the Caribbean, and Africa. My wife and I, Janet and I, taught English in Cincinnati for 10 years to adults, many of them undocumented immigrants from Mexico and Guatemala. We developed friendships that in one case became a relationship that we consider to be family. We learned to appreciate the wonderful people who take great risks to leave a familiar place for a new start. Immigrants tend to be brave people, even in the face of adversity, often heroic in the face of mortal threat, and fairly resilient in response to devastating changes. They live in hope. Those are qualities that we embrace as Americans. The U.S. is a place where they want to work and take care of their families, but they are often looked down on and viewed as a threat. Many of them left dangerous situations in their countries of origin. One young man I came to know lived in slavery as a teenager in Mexico. A young man from Guatemala said his parents told him to escape before he was killed by gangs. I believe many Americans' resistance to immigration comes from fear of people who seem racially and ethnically different from what has been the traditional or stereotypic white Americans. Those fears are often created and made worse by leaders who want to divide ordinary people and thereby maintain power. I believe there are two primary ways to convince more Americans that immigrants, especially asylum seekers, should be welcomed. Now, I'm coming back to that theme again. Facts and feelings, solutions and stories. First, we need to tell stories and support the immigrants in telling their stories. that will show the common humanity of all of us. Secondly, we need to speak the truth that many objective studies have shown. Immigrants to the United States, both documented and undocumented, make us a more prosperous nation. I believe they also add to our diversity, which makes the United States a more interesting and enjoyable place to live. I am proud to be connected with UUs for Social Justice as we work for more just, humane immigration policies. I have been honored to participate in online calls that the UUSJ set up with congressional aides in support of the Afghan Adjustment Act. I was able to speak as a Vietnam veteran to ask and demand that we help the people who supported our forces in Afghanistan, just as we helped the Vietnamese people who supported our forces many years ago. I believe in living in hope, just as immigrants do. That is how I honor the memory of formerly enslaved people who influenced my family and honor the recent immigrants who have influenced me. We need to be true to our values and continue building momentum for justice for immigrants. Now it's time for our hymn. That's my script. Please rise as you are willing and able and sing hymn 1028 in this book, The Fire of Commitment. Now, please join me in reading together the words that will appear on the screen as we extinguish our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment that we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Alex asked me to let you know that he has to go to meet with some respective new UUs, and so he will not be available after the service right away, but I'll be out there if you have any questions about anything.